My name is Paul Nathanail. I work for a consultancy called GHD. And I've put this equation up there as an example of perhaps how not to communicate with non-specialists, and in particular with local residents. I'm going to tell you a story. That's my background. That's me holding a molecule of something called a per and polyfluorinated alkyl substance, a PFAS, as part of a radio show in Australia. I've been around for a while, and I'm going to skip over all this stuff. I like people to know what the punchline is. So if you're going to communicate the findings of what is complicated soil risk and spatial data science, my hashtag TLDR is communicate interactively, allow people to ask questions, confirm that what they've received is what you meant them to receive, communicate fully. There's no point in holding anything back. Communicate clearly, put things into context, talk about people's land, soil, health, their families, and so on. Make it relevant to them. This is about whether or not your land is okay, safe to live on, or whether we need to do anything about it. Science is replete with jargon, and every discipline has its own. It's there for a purpose, but perhaps one of the inadvertent consequences is you can lose people very quickly. Communicate humbly. There will be people in a community group who may well know much more about a particular topic than we do. And have I mentioned about being interactive? The old adage is you have one mouth and two ears. So continual listening, continual inviting comment and question is really powerful if your intent is to share understanding with your audience. My story begins in a former gasworks, the kind of places where we used to heat up coal to make gas, popular in the 19th century, dying out towards the latter end of the 20th century, leaving behind a legacy of contamination. That legacy is investigated in a number of legal lenses across the world. In the UK, it's the Environmental Protection Act. And what we're trying to do is to decide very clearly whether land is contaminated and needs to have something done to it, or not contaminated. It's a very binary question. Going back to my site, 2000, the legislation comes into effect. That then triggers a series of investigations that took place over a number of years. And in 2012, the decision was taken that some of the residents, some of the houses that had been built on a former gasworks were in fact dangerous and contaminated land. What do? You serve a notice on somebody to do some remediation. That person then appealed and said, not me, Gov. 2017, that appeal was upheld by the judges, the planning inspector, and the minister for planning. And my team at the time was appointed to review the work, carry out further investigation and risk assessment. And last year, we concluded that the land was not contaminated land. We had to go and share that with households with 100 households to give them the results and essentially allow them to resume buying and selling their houses and get on with their lives. So that's this human context. The gasworks developed over the years. This is what it looked like in 1902. This is what it looked like in the 1940s, 1950s. And these are the locations where we went and took soil samples over various stages. So you can see the gasworks has now got lots of houses. It's got some green space. It's got roads. And there were something like 700 or 800 locations where we went and took soil samples. We wanted to prove that they came from gasworks, no great surprise. So we looked at this plot of the ratio of two of the constituents of gasworks contamination against a ratio of two different ones. And lo and behold, our samples plot in here, which is carbonation and coke oven tar. Good stuff. So the question then was, well, was there any spatial correlation? Could we say there are high areas and low areas? Earlier on, one of our speakers was using geostatistics, and she began to invoke Tobler's law of geography. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So here we have the variogram for one of the contaminants that we measured at each of these locations. It's a contaminant called benzoapyrene, BAP. And here you have the sample separation and the semivariance. This is an automatically fitted semivariogram model, a spherical model, and you can see that actually there is very little structure there. The nugget is very, very low, the range is very small, and the sill is both exceeded and not exceeded by many, many of the pairs of points. So in essence, if you were going to fit a line of best fit through that manually, you'd probably do that and have it horizontal. What does that mean? It means that the behavior is completely random, completely without spatial correlation, spatial continuity. So you can treat the entire estate as a oneer. Now, there's no point in talking about variance and sills and nuggets and ranges if you're not dealing with somebody who at least is familiar with the language of geostatistics and the work of Georges Mathurin and Janel and Huitbrecht. So what our speaker earlier on was hinting at was Tobler's law of geography. Things closer together are more similar than things further apart. And the variogram quantifies that. We have separation, and then we have a measure of distance. So how close or far apart things are, and how similar or different they are. The units are meters, the units of distance, and in my particular case, the square of the concentration of the contaminant. So using language like how far things apart are, how separated they are, and how similar or different they are, allows somebody to look at that graph and ask themselves, is there a pattern? Can I see anything there? And the answer is no. I can put a line through that like that. And so in this particular case, Tobler's law of geography doesn't really apply. There is nothing there that is more similar when they're close together than when they are further apart. And therefore, we can look at the entire housing estate in one go, which is what we did. Now, this is quite a complicated diagram of toxicology and exposure estimation to the people from the contaminants on the soil. And in essence, what you're looking for is these bits, these dashed lines are the soil, and we're looking for this area not being overlapping with this area where bad stuff happens, and so we are happy. We present that in the form of a conceptual model looking at a relationship between contaminants, the chemistry, the people, and the way they get exposed. And because we don't have these links, these pathways, the land is okay. It doesn't fall into the definition of contaminated land. So in 12, 13 minutes, I've taken you through soil science, land contamination risk management, a bit of geostatistics. I've alluded to some toxicology, and hopefully you've begun to realize that there is a story here that would allow residents to say, well, we know some stuff's been done. They can ask questions. We have people observing us on site, asking questions during public meetings. And then at the end of it all, also having the chance to ask questions just to make sure they were happy with what they had been hearing. If you want any more details, look me up on Twitter. My email address was on the start of the slides. Happy to have the conversation. And maybe now in the last couple of minutes of my time, you might have some questions that you may wish to interact with me over. Let's see if there are any questions. I seem to have escaped without interaction. I've got 1 minute to go, and I'm really looking forward to Thomas's presentation on hexagons.
Hi, Paul. I actually have a question for you. So the approach to these kinds of studies, they're quite consistent across different countries. You obviously work for an Australian firm, and do they typically do this the same way in each country, or is it quite different in the UK?
No, quite different. I work for an Australian company. The work was done in the UK when I was with my own company, LQM, whose logo was on the diagrams. We're trying to introduce this kind of thinking into Australia. We've done a little bit of the work of this kind of stuff in other parts of Europe, in Cyprus, currently doing it in Abu Dhabi. There are variations on the theme, but the focusing in on the technical detail and then sharing that with members of the public who might be affected, it is not always done as well as it could be. And you know that when the newspapers don't get interested afterwards.
Yeah, I can imagine. We do actually have 2 questions now, Paul. Stuart Norris has asked, great talk. On the working with the public, what was the residents' response to being told that their land wasn't contaminated?
They were relieved because they've been living with the uncertainty for 12, 14 years. So they were quite happy that we'd come along and within about 18 months or so had come to a conclusion that stood scrutiny, and that was good. The other question is about doing a directional variogram in the prevailing wind direction. We did look at directional variograms. They're also flat and random. The prevailing wind direction here wasn't relevant because we were looking at contamination spread by soil being turned over the years. There's another site where a fire was the issue, and there we have very much looked at the directionality along the plume and at right angles to it. So yes, we did look at directional variograms.
Brilliant. Okay, well, any links that you can share in the chat pool so that we can read more about your work would be really helpful. And for anybody who's wondering or wants to share Paul's talk, it will be available on YouTube pretty soon. So do follow the YouTube channel and you'll receive a notification when it goes live. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you next year as well.
Thank you. Bye.